Hello, my name is Jonathan, and I'm going to be refuting Eliza's argument about how inmates should have the opportunity to receive a higher education while incarcerated. To start, she argues that higher educational programs in prisons are cost-effective, and higher educational programs in prisons lead to reductions in recidivism, in which she defined recidivism as being the relapse of a released criminal into of a released prisoner in a criminal behavior. And her third claim is that higher educational programs in prisons aid in inmates' personal development. To start, I'm going to refute her first claim that higher educational programs in prisons are cost-effective because they are not necessarily as cost-effective as she says. For one, she quotes the Federal Bureau of Prisons that programs usually cost around $2,000 a year, while the cost of reincarcerating an inmate after they've been released costs around $10,000 a year. However, in the study, which lasted from 1987 to 1994, they did not have any information about how some prisoners still relapsed after the term of the study ending, which is 1994. They also did not address the issue about how about how educational programs which apply to prisoners work for 100% of them, even though some were not released in the first place. So her argument of cost effectiveness applies that educational benefits would have applied to everyone, no matter if they were going to be released eventually, if they had a death sentence, or if they were only there for a few months. If they were only there for a few months, they would have assumed the cost but not have gained much of a benefit from it. Well, in the end, also, if the amount of spending for educational benefits for prisoners ends up being around 100%, because each prisoner under a higher educational ability and higher educational opportunity, will have the right to it. Not all prisoners would end up relapsing to prison, which would increase the cost of relapse. So that in itself is inherently misleading, because even though 100% of those who will get a higher educational benefit, they will not go. There is not a certain chance that they will either not be going back to prison or be going back to prison. Oh, that was a mouthful to say. To address her secondary claim, higher educational programs in prisons lead to reductions in recidivism. As I said earlier, recidivism is the relapse of criminals in the prisoners in the criminal activity. And even if higher educational programs did decrease recidivism, what she is arguing is that basically education is a leeway for prisoners to escape their cycle of criminal activity due to either them not having an ability to make a living for themselves or being in desperate situations such as that. But what she doesn't take into account is that many prisoners do not have those circumstances. For instance, some prisoners are in prison because they are serial offenders in the first place, as in they're gangsters, or they have choices in life for which they pursue organized crime, which in a criminal sense, they are bound to keep repeating because they are part of that system still. In addition to that, education does not necessarily reform the will to commit crimes in the first place. Even if you help someone by educating them about the world and giving them the skills to pursue a job, that does not really endue them with the will to not commit crimes in the first place. Psychologically, some people are not to point any fingers, but some people are sociopathically inclined to not follow laws, as in they simply do not prefer a lifestyle that is like other people. Some people will just re-offend no matter what you do, because they're not on the same level of sanity that is required of normal citizens to live a normal life. They simply do not desire to live a crime-free life. And following that, education does not guarantee a prisoner can find a job outside of prison, which is one of Elisa's major arguments. So we are all students in this room right now, and we all know that it's hard to find a job in the market. And especially if you are a prisoner who has been released from prison and you're competing with students who are citizens and have never committed a felony, you already are at a disadvantage to get a job. And this statistic means that many people, many ex-cons would have trouble finding a job even though they received an education in prison, which means that in terms of the recidivism, they might end up recommitting a crime anyway because they did not really improve the situation. As well as that, my opponent's use of Harris' study Recidivism among federal prisoners released in 1987, which is the Federal Bureau of Prisons study on the subject of prisoner recidivism, was conducted in 1994, which is by now at least 23 years aging. That being said, the prison industrial complex has changed vastly since then, with the number of prisoners rising, and for all we know, that that source may not be reliable anymore. To follow on my opponent's third claim, inmate personal development isn't a high priority focus on reforming the American prison system. What she argues in essence is that educational opportunities for prisoners will help develop their personal attributes such as intelligence and creativity. But I would argue that these are not necessarily important to the goals of prison. According to stopthecrime.org, a website dedicated to addressing the problems in the prison industrial complex, the goal of prison is built to provide retribution for prisoners and to provide a form of repaying their debt to society that a prisoner has sustained in that time. Personal development is not really an important goal, and nonetheless should not be provided to prisoners for free because they don't need it. It's simply not important. Many people who are normal citizens do not take personal development courses because they simply don't need it either. It's not that important to them. In addition to that, my opponent makes an overgeneralization in the way how she attributes crime to the cycle of poverty, in which she states that many criminals end up committing crimes because they are born into the circumstance of it. They come from poor neighborhoods with high crime rates. They also come with areas that are associated with gang and mafia activity. I would argue against this though, because many prisoners, which is commonly known, are not from poor neighborhoods, are not from disadvantaged circumstances. Some people are just, some criminals commit crimes because they simply have the will to, or because they don't have the will to live a normal life, like I have said earlier. And in essence, giving those such people educational opportunities would not have any effect on them, whether or not they would relapse into criminal activity or not. To sum it up, higher educational programs are not as cost effective as they might be put. Higher educational programs in prisons do not necessarily lead to reductions in recidivism. And higher educational programs in prisons are not, personal development in higher educational programs is not necessary for prison. Thank you.
All right, the structural stuff is fine. You've got counterclaims on the first point, suggesting all these explanations as to why it would not make a difference. You've got some general criticism of the evidence that the advocate presents, but you don't have any examples or evidence of your own. We've got a lot of assertions, and that is a repeated pattern in most of the argument, where you make claims, you give an explanation, you suggest a reason would work a particular way, but you have no grounds to support the inference that you're drawing, and I think that that's a little bit problematic. If this was an argument that was being given like immediately after you heard the response, if this was a debate and you didn't know what the topic was going to be ahead of time and you had to respond right afterwards, I think this would be a pretty good response, reasonable challenges. But given that you had some time to do some research and digging background into it, it really feels very thin. It's just full of a lot of presses and assertions and maybe challenges to the reasoning process, but they're not very substantiated challenges to the reasoning process. And although it's nicely organized, and I think you explain things pretty well, although you did have the one problem in that one section where it was like, what the hell is he ultimately trying to say? I think it was the end of the first section there. I think we got it figured out, but it does get a little complicated. It wasn't until the very end that you actually presented some evidence, and that's on an argument about value issues, which is not really a claim of fact. That whether or not we ought to be spending our time and energy on this, should this be a priority in comparison to other things, that's a value question that's different than the question of does it work to produce these particular outcomes. I did think that you had some interesting analysis on the points, and that if you had any evidence to support that analysis, these would be stronger arguments. All right, thank you. Shamreen.